one of the other interesting observations is, of course, the lack of property supply. And this is a very, very important conversation that you've got some very nice slides on. So, I'll let you take your long run and give us the latest Leithian view of the housing supply conundrum.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting report that was released a few weeks ago from the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. Now, they released their 2025 State of Supply report. So it's an annual report they do where they basically look at their 5-year ahead projections for dwelling construction. And then they work out, over that 5-year period, are we going to have a surplus or a shortage of homes, etc. So as we know, the Albanese government has got this fantastical target to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years, which requires 240,000 homes per annum. Nobody believed this is possible, right? So Australia's best ever year of housing construction was about 223,500, I think, in 2017. It's in the chart there in the middle. And that there was about 7% below Albo's fantastical annual target, right? So we've never been anywhere close to that before. And currently construction rates are tracking near decade lows at about 180,000. So again, about 60,000 below their target. And the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council released their projections and they said, guess what, Albo? You got no hope of meeting that target. So the council forecast that only 938,000 dwellings would be built nationwide over the next 5 years. So over the 5-year period from July 1 last year, which is when the target started, to mid-2029. And that's 262,000, just over 20% below Labor's target. And I put in that Albo's housing target chart, you can see the green line. That's basically their forecast. And as you can see, it's going to miss by a mile. To make matters worse, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council plugged in the federal government's own population projections from the Centre for Population, which is run out of the Australian Treasury. And they then worked it out against their construction targets, less demolitions. And this is the bottom left table there. And they worked out that over we had a shortage, so an undersupply of 86,000 in 2023-24, but that was before the target started. But they worked out that over the next 5 years, so I should say the current year we're in now, 2024-25, and the following 4 years, they worked out that Australia would have an undersupply of 79,000 homes. So this housing supply situation, according to the government's own advisor, is going to get worse. Now, I didn't put the chart in here, I wish I had, but Shane Oliver from AMP forecast a couple of months ago, he estimated Australia's current undersupply to be somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 dwellings. So you can add that 79,000 to 200 or 300,000. And that gives you an idea of the scale of shortage that we're missing, that we're going to experience. Now, here's the real kicker here, Martin. The bottom chart on the right, so below Albo's housing target chart, this is absolutely critical, and this was buried at the back of the report, and I don't think anyone other than me actually picked this up, but I've been hammering it pretty hard. The government's own council confirms that the best way to solve the housing shortage, they don't say it in the report, but you can see it in the numbers, is to actually cut immigration. Because that chart on the left-hand panel and the right, you can see they do a sensitivity analysis where they say, what happens if population growth 15% stronger than what the Centre for Population predicts, which is the baseline forecast? And what happens if it's 15% less? Here's the thing. If Australia's population merely grew at 15% less than the big Australia settings set out by the Centre for Population, which is ongoing high immigration, instead of having a 79,000 shortage over 5 years, guess what? We'd actually have a surplus over those 5 years of 40,000. So that there is proof positive coming from the government's own council, Supply and Affordability Council, that the number one solution to Australia's housing shortage, as I've been saying for years, is to cut immigration, right? Slow immigration. And this is only 15% slowdown in population growth. So still, the population is still going to be growing very strongly. It's just going to be a little bit less strong than what they predict. And if we just did that over the next 5 years, instead of underbuilding by 79,000 dwellings, we'd actually overbuild by 40,000. So we wouldn't have a surplus of homes, but Shane Oliver's 200 to 300,000 cumulative shortage that we currently have would be reduced by 40,000. And what do you think would happen if we actually cut immigration right back? We wouldn't have a housing shortage anymore. So this is just crazy stuff here. We keep getting gaslit that housing supply, it's all a supply problem. We need to magically, totally unrealistically build more homes. The government's own advisor doesn't think that's possible. The Housing Industry Association released their own projections, which I haven't included here, but I wrote about macro business. They don't think it's possible. Masters Builder Australia doesn't think it's possible. Urban Task Force, nobody believes that this is anywhere near remotely possible that we can meet the Albanese government's housing target. And the government's own advisor has said black and white that they're going to miss it by 262,000 dwellings over the 5 years. And if we just cut population growth by 15%, not even a lot, guess what? We'd actually build more homes than what we need for that population growth over that 5 year period. So it's pretty basic stuff here, Martin. But unfortunately, the latest figures from the various figures suggest that, guess what? Immigration's actually rebounding again. So I've got some charts here as well. So what the official data showed, so the quarterly population series from the ABS is only current to September last year. And what it showed is that, and that's the top left, this is from Justin Farbo at Antipode and Macro. If you look at the black line there, that is the official net overseas migration forecast up to September last year. Now, there's a corresponding series from the ABS, which is current to March, and that's their monthly net permanent long-term arrivals data. And it tends to track net overseas migration very closely, as you can see by Justin Farbo's chart. And what it's shown is that at the start of this year, the first 3 months of this year, net overseas migration has actually rebounded. But based on this figure and based on this series, which, as I said, tracks very closely. And not just that, the top chart to the right of that, the civilian population aged over 15 years, that I grabbed out of the monthly labour force released to April. You can see the population growth in the first 4 months of this year is also accelerated. So it was tracking at about 0.4% quarterly growth. It was tracking at 0.4% towards the end of 2024. It's now rebounded to nearly 0.7%. So according to these two series, immigration's ramped back up. The chart over from the right of that, the net overseas migration working age population, that's basically the same civilian population in annual terms, plotted against net overseas migration. That's from Alex Joyner at IFM Investors. You can see that there's been a little spike in the annual rate, which is shown up there. And also, just to the right of that, the far right, we've got rental vacancy rates. This is from CoreLogic. Again, Justin Farbo charted this yesterday. And it shows that the rental vacancy rates tick lower at the start of this year. So it was sort of starting to rise up a bit at the end of last year. Now it's swung back down. And I think that relates to this rebound in immigration. And here's the upshot. So the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council says that if you want to solve the housing shortage, cut immigration, right? Slow population growth, pretty obvious stuff. Just below Justin Farbo's chart on the left, the far left, I've got the long-term population projections for Australia. It's that little narrow, table. Sorry, I've stuffed a lot on this page. And what that is, that's from the Centre for Population's December 2024 population statement. And what it showed is that the federal government's own population projection advisory agency from out of the Treasury forecast that Australia's population is going to grow by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years, right? So 13.5 million people in the next 40 years is the equivalent of adding another Sydney, another Melbourne, and another Brisbane to Australia's current population. So if you think of Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane right now, every dwelling in those three cities, every piece of infrastructure in those three cities, water supplies, energy, everything, all that is going to have to be replicated in Australia in the next 40 years to stop housing getting worse, to stop livability getting worse, to stop productivity from getting worse. It's just an impossible task. And effectively, what we have here, the federal government has engineered this housing crisis, not just through dumb policies like negative gearing, capital gains taxes, blah, 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 blah. but also just by engineering massive population growth. So the bottom middle chart there, that it only goes to 2023. I think it's mid-2023. It's from the World Bank. But I wanted to put, plot Australia versus these various other countries. And, between 2000 and 2023, Australia's population grew by 40%, which is higher than anywhere else in the advanced world. And in fact, if you took the current population of 27.7 million, I think it is, using the ABS population clock, which is updated daily, we've actually grown our population by 46% since the turn of the century. So that's obviously pretty old data. It's now 46%. Is there any wonder that we have a housing shortage? We've literally grown the population by 7.6 million people this century alone, which is like 1.5 Sydneys. No wonder we have a housing shortage. In 24 years, just over 24 years, we've added more than like 1.5 Sydneys to Australia's population, which guess what? Required 1.5 Sydneys worth of housing. Pretty difficult task. Now, what I've done on the right-hand side, the bottom right, is that this is a chart from the Grattan Institute, and this again shows why this supply situation is so dire. Because we're fire hosing demand. So obviously every person you import from overseas needs somewhere to live, right? You need housing for them. At the same time, the Grattan Institute, which is a massive Big Australia shill, even they admitted that a very small percentage of migrants actually work in construction. So we're bringing in a whole bunch of people, pumping up housing demand, requiring homes, yet the migrants we bring in overwhelmingly do not work in construction at the same rate as the incumbent population. So we're not adding to supply, but we're adding massively to demand through our immigration system. And voila, guess what? We get a housing shortage. This is insane. And is there any wonder that we have a housing shortage? This is a government policy caused. It's deliberate. They'll never admit it to you. And these same pricks basically want to make out like it's a supply issue. But as we've seen from their own advisory council, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, if we just cut immigration, we can solve the housing shortage. It's not rocket science.
That's really the point, isn't it? And it's interesting, of course, the Treasury keep talking about the bigger Australia to get more tax and all of those sorts of things. So there's a reason that they put out there. But when you think of is it 1 million students or some stupid number of students coming in as well?
1.1 million enrolled as at the end of 2024.
Yeah.
And that's an absolute record. And I mean, that doesn't mean there's 1.1 million temporary student visas on issue, because some of them are dual enrolled, etc. So they get counted twice. But irrespective, mate, the number of students we have in the country, if you count international student graduate visas, 600 and whatever it is, 1,000, plus graduate visas, about 250, plus all the ones that have gone from a student visa onto a bridging visa because they've overstayed the visa, they don't want to go home, they've appealed it to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. There's a lot of those too. The number is off the charts. And, it's just one component of it. But the fact of the matter is, Australia is we're importing renters into a supply-constrained market, which is leading to a rental shortage. It's not rocket science. You can't import hundreds of thousands of renters every year and then not have enough rental properties for those renters, or new rental properties come on board, and then expect magically there not to be a rental crisis. I mean, rental growth has slowed down, and slowed down for a couple of reasons, because the affordability is just, we've hit an affordability ceiling. That chart at the start from CoreLogic, or Cotality, they call themselves now, showed that that households are spending a record, well, at the end of 2024, spending a record share of their income on rents. That's on the right-hand side. So there's only so much blood you can squeeze from a stone. When they're already spending so much, they can't afford to spend a whole lot more. And the way households then deal with that is they then move into group housing, they stay at home longer, so kids don't move out of home, all this sort of stuff. And this is the kind of stuff you don't see in the statistics. So there are ways to ameliorate the higher cost of renting, And again, the vacancy rates, as you saw before, are, crash through the floor. There are ways to do it, but it's not optimal. Like, it's not optimal to have people not being able to move out of home and having to live in group homes when they shouldn't have to, and spending such a high proportion of their income on rents, all this sort of stuff. And then it wrecks them trying to become a first home buyer, because typically when you're buying your first home, you rent first, right? So that's what I did. I moved out of home, moved in with my now wife, whatever. We rented for, several years, saved up a deposit, bought a house. But if you're paying so much more on your rents, you can't save the deposit. So the way the government's papering over the cracks is they're like, oh, okay, they can't save the deposit. You know what we'll do? We'll just reduce the deposit to 5% by guaranteeing 15% of the mortgage. That'll suck more people into the market. But in the end, it's, as I said before, it's self-defeating, because you're just going to bid up house prices. And we're going to end up with a more expensive housing market, i.e. prices will be higher, and households carrying larger debts than they otherwise would. And you're back to square one, actually worse off than you would have been if you hadn't done this policy. And that is the Australian situation writ large. It's all can kicking. It's all temporary band-aids on top of band-aids, but they never actually want to solve the underlying problem. And again, I'll argue till the day I'm in the ground. For me, the number one, issue here is the government is just growing the population like a science experiment through this forced high migration. In the 60 years following World War II, up until the mid-2000s, so up to 2004, net overseas migration averaged 90,000 per year. We'd only ever exceeded 150,000 in 2 of those years, and only just exceeded 150,000. Between 2005 and 2019, the COVID, net overseas migration averaged just over 220,000. So it went from 90,000 on average for 60 years, jumped up to 220,000 plus, just over 220,000. Again, in that 60-year period, we only exceeded 150,000 twice, and only just, to 220,000 being the norm. And then now, since COVID finished, we've been averaging, 400,000 plus. Is there any wonder that we have a housing shortage? It's insane.
Yeah, but deliberate. Insane but deliberate is the point. And it was interesting, somebody a little earlier, Mr. Blister, asked this question, which is quite relevant. Interested if you had data on what percentage of new migrants are experiencing mortgage stress and rental stress. In fact, I made a show, I think last week or the week before, and the rental stress is highest in the first generation migrants. It's the highest proportion of my cohorts. So a lot of people who come into Australia immediately get themselves into rental pressure. Not surprising because of the affordability, but they're also showing up in the mortgage stress data as well, because quite a few are buying out. If you think of Point Cook, for example, areas around there, or if I take a Melbourne example, and they leveraged up, got big mortgages, but they're also struggling with the cost of living. So what we're finding is a lot of people who are coming into the country are actually now dropping directly into the stressed bucket, which again is more nonsensical thinking.
Absolutely, and I'd argue that the cohort that are most harmed by this high immigration policy is actually recent migrants, because they've come over here. They tend to have less savings. So obviously there is a cohort that are extremely rich, right? But most wouldn't be, and they wouldn't have as much family help potentially. So they can't just go and stay at home longer, save up for a deposit, etc. And as you said, they tend to live further way out, so they're stuck commuting long distances and blah blah blah. So this is a policy that's absolutely bad for everyone, really. And for that reason, the Australian Population Research Institute does an annual survey on migration and on migration attitudes, and they find that migrants also oppose Big Australia. Tend to oppose Big Australia. So more than, they not quite as much as the incumbent population, but they also oppose Big Australia immigration. And they also want immigration to be lower as well. So, and for good reason, because it makes their life harder. If you're living out in, Western Sydney or Western Melbourne, in one of these growth areas, it's pretty bleak, and you're just getting crush loaded every single year. And in the case of Melbourne, I can't speak for Sydney as much, but in the case of Melbourne, you're not getting any infrastructure. So a couple of growth areas in Melbourne, so Melton, so out Wyndham, Melton and Bacchus Marsh, they don't even have an electrified train. So we started stuffing migrants into that place at about 2000, right? We've been doing it for decades. They're still running on diesel trains. At the same time, the Victorian government is spending, it's going to end up being, to build the thing, probably 120 billion, and to build and run it about 200 billion according to the Parliamentary Budget Office. They're building this 90-kilometre orbital rail loop in the middle suburbs of Melbourne, which nobody asked for, and basically is totally unnecessary to go between places where you'd never want to go anyway. It's going to be totally underutilised. It's going to bury the state in debt. It's going to suck up the infrastructure budget for a generation. At the same time as the poor sods out in the West who don't get this train are still stuck using a bloody diesel train. And, and then they just want to force more. And those are the areas that are supposed to receive the largest share of new migrants. So this is just disastrous policy here. It really is.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, A23 asked, thanks for Super Chat as well, exactly who is winning from high migration, because there are some winners.
Absolutely. So it's the growth lobby, right? So the growth lobby are big business, big property, and the education/migration industry. So your universities, your private colleges, your migration agents, and that whole racket there. So there are certainly winners, right? So if you're a Jerry Harvey or Harry Triggerboff or whatever, if you're a Jerry Harvey and you run Harvey Norman, there is nothing better than big migration for you, because that guy, Harvey Norman owns their warehouses, so they got the land appreciation on the land holdings. It's basically a big land bank. They get to sell, growing the population 2% every year means 2% more growing customer base, more people to sell white goods and imported crap to. Those guys win. The banking sector wins. More people to lend money to. Great. The property industry wins. More demand every single year for what you're selling. Universities love it. VCs can get paid over $1 million here. The senior executives cream it with all the international students, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole industry around this stuff. The Australian Treasury, I've said, is basically a growth lobby now, because the federal budget benefits from high immigration because they collect 80% of the taxes. They get all the personal income tax, and importing migrants, most of them end up working, obviously. So you pay higher income taxes. They get all that. They get the uplift from company taxes. So as Jerry Harvey sells more imported crap to all the extra new residents, they make more profits. The federal government gets cut of that, goes to the federal treasury. The problem is the costs aren't borne by the federal treasury, right? The costs are borne by the state governments, local governments, the ordinary punter in Australia who, gets to see all their state government assets get sold off because they've got to sell them to try and, pay for all the extra people coming in. You end up building toll roads everywhere. In the case of Sydney, you got toll roads left, right, and centre. So you used to be able to drive around there 25 years ago and avoid toll roads. Now you just get fleeced by Transurban. And why are you getting fleeced? Well, they had to build all these roads to keep up with the massive population growth foisted upon them by the federal government. So this is basically, there are winners and losers here, but unfortunately the average punter is a loser of this policy. Whereas, big business, big property, education, migration, racket, and the federal treasury love it. And that's why they push this garbage on us.
Yeah, and I will make the point that some of the mainstream media channels are very much fixated on the growth agenda and on the high migration agenda. And if you should ever mention, the migration question, you are immediately classed as a racist or, antisocial or whatever. But the truth is,
a right-wing nut job.
Yes. But the truth is, this is by far the biggest conundrum that we face as a nation, because we can't go on going on like we're going on, right? Because house prices will continue to rise. The ability to be able to serve the population in terms of healthcare, in terms of water, in terms of other resources, in terms of getting around. I mean, it's more and more impossible. And, whilst the lobby will say, well, Australia is a big country, surely we can accommodate a few more people, we're cramming them into smaller and smaller and smaller, which takes us quite nicely into the next discussion point, which is about, do you want to live in a shoebox